Look around you. Every person you see is wearing an invisible mask, carefully constructed to hide their deepest vulnerabilities, their hidden agendas, and their psychological baselines. Most people look at these masks and see a reality, but there is a rare percentage of the population born with a hyper-acute neurological radar, people we call empaths. For the first half of their lives, this radar is a curse. They don't just see the mask, they absorb the chaotic, agonizing noise behind it. They bleed for wounds they didn't cause. But something happens when that empath is pushed past the breaking point. When they experience a level of deep, systemic psychological suffering, whether through betrayal, prolonged emotional manipulation, or profound loss, their brain undergoes a violent, permanent architectural shift. They don't just heal, they re-engineer. What most people call healing from trauma is actually a process of desensitization. But for the empath, deep suffering acts as a crucible that burns away the soft, naive tissue of their personality and replaces it with cold, tactical steel. The suffering strips away their cognitive biases. It forces them to look at the very person or situation that broke them and map out the exact behavioral mechanics of how it happened. They stop asking, "Why me?" and start asking, "What were the indicators I missed?" This speech is not a lecture on emotional recovery. It is a behavioral autopsy of human transformation. If you have ever felt like your ability to feel the world was a weakness that left you exposed, or if you are currently sitting in the wreckage of a profound emotional betrayal, what you are about to hear will fundamentally alter how you view your own mind. We are going to deconstruct the exact mechanics of how deep suffering forces an empath's brain to upgrade its operating system from a passive, vulnerable receptor into an unshakable human lie detector. By the end of this brief, you will understand why a broken empath who has successfully processed deep suffering is the most psychologically formidable person in any room. They can no longer be gaslit because they see the architecture of the lie before it is even spoken. They can no longer be manipulated because they have mapped the exact behavioral loops of the manipulator. If you choose to look away now, you will remain a victim to the invisible currents of human influence, constantly absorbing the emotional debris of the people around you. But if you stay, if you look directly into the mechanics of this transformation, you will learn how the mind turns agonizing vulnerability into absolute psychological sovereignty. Let's look at the data. Right now, your brain is processing thousands of microsignals every second. The tilt of a head, the subtle tension in a vocal cord, the micro-expressions that flash across a human face for less than 1/5 of a second. Most people are completely blind to this. They live in a state of cognitive somnambulism, entirely unaware of the psychological engineering happening all around them. But if you're an empath, you don't have the luxury of being blind. Your nervous system is dialed into a high-frequency bandwidth. You feel the unsaid. You absorb the hidden tension in a room like a sponge. And because of this, you have likely been targeted, exploited, or deeply broken. You have likely experienced a level of suffering that felt like it was tearing down your very identity. But I am here to tell you that this suffering is not your destruction. It is your calibration. Today, we are mapping the precise behavioral shift that occurs when an empath goes through the crucible of deep suffering, and we will reveal exactly why this agonizing process transforms them into the most psychologically unshakable, hyper-aware operators on the planet. If you want to stop being the prey and start understanding the hidden mechanics of human behavior, you need to understand this transformation. Every human being operates from a behavioral baseline. For the unawakened empath, that baseline is rooted in a fatal cognitive bias, the assumption that everyone else possesses the same internal map of empathy that they do. They believe that if they show kindness, the other person will feel a reciprocal chemical drive to do the same. Deep suffering is the violent destruction of that illusion. When an empath experiences profound betrayal, especially from a dark triad personality who exploits their empathy, the brain faces a massive cognitive dissonance. The old map doesn't work anymore. The suffering forces the empath to execute a cold, hard reboot of their psychological operating system. They drop the projection of their own goodness onto others. They stop looking at what people say and begin observing, with clinical detachment, what people do. Before the suffering, the empath's boundary system is non-existent. They absorb emotional data indiscriminately. If someone next to them is anxious, angry, or deceptive, the empath's mirror neurons fire aggressively, causing them to physically feel that state. It is exhausting, passive, and dangerous. But deep suffering builds a firewall. When the emotional nervous system is overloaded by trauma, it adapts for survival. The empath doesn't stop feeling the microsignals. Their radar actually becomes sharper, but the processing of that data shifts from the emotional center of the brain to the prefrontal cortex. They no longer absorb the room, they profile the room. When someone enters their space with hidden hostility or manipulative intent, the transformed empath doesn't feel a wave of anxiety. Instead, they identify the behavioral indicators: the asymmetrical smile, the forced vocal warmth, the subtle violations of physical proximity. The sponge becomes a filter. The raw emotion is converted instantly into actionable, objective data. You cannot defeat an enemy you do not understand. Through deep suffering, the empath is forced to study the anatomy of their own pain. They analyze the tactics used against them. They learn the loops of gaslighting, the subtle pacing and leading of emotional manipulation, and the exploitation of guilt. Because they have felt the full weight of these psychological mechanisms, they develop an absolute immunity to them. You cannot gaslight an empath who has mapped the exact architecture of a lie. You cannot guilt trip someone who has completely detached their self-worth from external validation. The transformed empath understands human needs, insecurities, and micro-expressions at a level that most intelligence operatives spend decades trying to master. They see right through the mask because they know exactly how the mask is constructed. The world looks at a suffering empath and sees someone who is broken. That is a critical tactical error. They are not broken. They are shedding a skin that no longer serves them. The individual who emerges from that deep, agonizing crucible is no longer a victim of their environment. They are a sovereign operator. They possess the rare, lethal combination of profound human intuition and cold, tactical discernment. They can walk into any room, read the hidden power dynamics within 90 seconds, and remain completely untouched by the emotional manipulation of others. If you are going through that suffering right now, stop trying to fix the old version of yourself. Let it burn. Pay attention to the data, study the indicators, and allow your mind to build its new, unshakable baseline. Your empathy was never your weakness. It was just waiting for the suffering to give it teeth. Every human being is born into an evolutionary framework designed for survival. But the human archetype we classify as an empath possesses a highly specific, hyperacute neurological architecture. This is not a spiritual gift or a mystical anomaly. It is a high-bandwidth biological radar system. From an evolutionary perspective, the empath's brain is wired to pick up on the subtlest shifts in the environment: microexpressions, vocal tonality changes, autonomic nervous system shifts in others, and the unspoken psychological tension in a room. Under normal circumstances, however, this incredibly powerful radar system is severely compromised by a collection of hardwired cognitive biases. The untrained, unsuffered empath operates under the projection bias, assuming that because their internal map of the world is driven by connection and mutual safety, Others operate under the exact same parameters. They filter the incoming data stream through a lens of naive optimism, constantly making excuses for behavioral red flags, explaining away malicious microexpressions, and allowing their own emotional desire for harmony to distort the reality of the human behavior right in front of them. Their radar is functional, but their analytical software is completely corrupted by the desire to see the best in people. Deep suffering changes the physics of this system entirely. When an empath undergoes profound psychological trauma, prolonged emotional manipulation, or an existential betrayal that shatters their reality, the brain is forced into an emergency adaptation sequence. The luxury of optimism is instantly stripped away because the brain realizes that its current cognitive map almost got it killed. In the crucible of deep suffering, the survival mechanisms of the brain demand an absolute commitment to objective truth. The evolutionary illusion that everyone has a good heart, or that behavior can be excused by intent, is violently dismantled. This forces the high-bandwidth radar system to disconnect from the emotional centers of the brain and reconnect directly to the analytical threat assessment centers of the prefrontal cortex. The data stream remains just as intense, but the filtering mechanism changes from emotional absorption to clinical observation. Once this architectural shift occurs, the empath begins to view human behavior with a level of clinical precision that looks almost supernatural to the untrained observer. The post-suffering empath no longer experiences a person's anger or deceit as an internal emotional wave. Instead, they observe it as a series of distinct behavioral indicators. They notice the precise micro-expression of contempt that flashes across a face before a compliment is paid. They hear the subtle drop in vocal pitch that indicates a fabricated story. They track the pacing and leading tactics of a manipulative personality in real time, mapping out the architecture of the interaction without being pulled into the emotional quicksand. The suffering acts as a psychological solvent that strips away the social conditioning and polite delusions that keep most humans blind to the hidden agendas around them. By forcing the empath to look directly at the darkest aspects of human nature to survive, the trauma permanently calibrates their perception to focus entirely on baseline metrics and verifiable data. The radar system is no longer a vulnerability that floods their system with chaotic, painful noise. It is transformed into a highly organized, weaponized tool of situational awareness. They see the human matrix exactly as it is, stripped of social masks, entirely because the pain broke the mechanism that allowed them to self-deceive. Every human being operates from a behavioral baseline, a psychological default setting that dictates how they respond to stress, interact with strangers, and navigate the social hierarchy. For the unawakened empath, this default setting is dangerously miscalibrated. Their baseline is rooted in chronic people-pleasing, overextended empathy, and a systemic vulnerability to external influence. They operate under a subconscious rulebook that dictates they must absorb the discomfort of others to maintain harmony, frequently compromising their own psychological safety to stabilize the room. This baseline is not an intentional choice. It is a conditioned response, a manifestation of naive optimism that leaves them highly exposed to predatory behavioral loops. They treat every interpersonal interaction with a default setting of trust, open proximity, and an instinctive desire to heal or fix whatever broken mechanics they sense in the people around them. This structural vulnerability makes them the ultimate target for manipulation, as their default response to boundary violations is self-blame and a doubling down on emotional accommodation. The experience of deep systemic suffering acts as a violent, irreversible disruption to this entire operational framework. When an empath is subjected to a profound psychological crisis, or a calculated emotional betrayal, the sheer volume of trauma overloads their default settings, causing a complete and permanent baseline shift. The brain realizes that its standard operating procedures are maladaptive and actively dangerous to its survival. In response, the nervous system executes a tactical reset, shifting the empath's default setting from naive openness to extreme situational awareness. The chronic urge to people-please is entirely incinerated by the survival mechanism, replaced by a cold, calculating focus on self-preservation and boundary integrity. This is not a state of hyper-vigilant paranoia or emotional numbness. Rather, it is a conscious transition into an elevated state of psychological readiness. The post-suffering empath no longer enters a room looking for ways to make others comfortable. Instead, they enter the room mapping the exits, identifying the dominant personalities, and establishing an immediate, unshakable perimeter around their own mental space. This baseline shift completely rewires the empath's behavioral feedback loops. Where they once used their hyperacute sensitivity to anticipate and fulfill the needs of others, they now use that exact same sensory bandwidth to audit their environment for hidden threats and behavioral anomalies. The default setting is now one of clinical detachment and strategic assessment. They no longer grant trust as a free concession. Trust must be earned through a consistent, verified track record of congruent behavioral indicators. The soft, porous boundaries that once allowed external emotional noise to flood their system are replaced by an ironclad psychological firewall. This structural reset changes how they respond to microaggressions, gaslighting, and passive-aggressive posturing. Instead of absorbing the hit and internalizing the stress, the transformed empath recognizes the maneuver instantly, labels it objectively, and neutralizes it with precise, unyielding boundaries. The suffering has essentially forced a complete systemic upgrade, shifting them from a vulnerable, reactive state of existence into a highly fortified, proactive stance, where their default relationship with the world is defined by absolute tactical awareness. Human behavior, when stripped of social politeness and cultural conditioning, operates on remarkably predictable, almost mechanical loops. For the majority of their lives, empaths are blind to this predictability because they view people through a highly emotional, deeply individualized lens. However, when an empath is subjected to a profound crucible of suffering, a severe psychological trauma, or a systematic dismantling of their trust, their perception undergoes a massive paradigm shift. They stop viewing harmful actions as deeply personal, malicious attacks and begin to recognize them as the predictable, automated outputs of fractured human psychology. This realization marks the birth of what can be termed forgivable manipulation, not because the empath excuses the behavior, but because they understand the mechanics of it so thoroughly that it loses all power to hurt them. They see that most people are walking scripts, driven entirely by hidden insecurities, unhealed developmental traumas, and desperate needs for validation, control, or attention. This shift in perspective transforms the empath from a wounded target into a detached clinical profiler. Through the intensive study of their own suffering and the behaviors that caused it, the empath learns to decode the subtle language of human vulnerability. They develop an uncanny ability to read micro-expressions and tactical vulnerabilities in real time. When a manipulative individual enters their orbit, the transformed empath does not see a formidable threat. They see a fragile ego operating a clumsy piece of psychological machinery. They spot the hyperreactivity hidden behind a confident facade, the microflash of panic when a narrative is subtly questioned, or the forced vocal warmth used to manufacture unearned intimacy. Because they have mapped out these behavioral loops in the darkest moments of their own survival, they can predict a manipulator's next move long before it is executed. They understand the pacing and leading of a conversational trap, the subtle deployment of guilt, and the precise timing of a gaslighting attempt. This hyper-awareness strips the predator of their power, rendering their tactics completely transparent and laughably ineffective. This mastery of human mechanics grants the post-suffering empath an extraordinary form of quiet authority. They no longer merely absorb the emotional energy of a room, they read its hidden architecture. They can identify who holds the real power, who is desperate for approval, and who is actively lying simply by observing body language, eye-accessing cues, and structural anomalies in speech patterns. The empath understands that human beings are constantly leaking information about their true intentions, and having survived the worst consequences of ignoring those leaks, they now track them with absolute, unwavering focus. This transformation shifts the empath's internal state from one of constant defensive anxiety to a position of immense tactical advantage. They navigate social and professional hierarchies with a calm, calculating precision, utilizing their deep understanding of human flaws not to inflict harm, but to insulate themselves entirely from the deceptive currents of the social matrix. By understanding the mechanical nature of human flaws, they achieve a state of psychological immunity where no one can pull their strings ever again. The culmination of deep psychological trauma forces a radical evolution in how an empath manages the sheer volume of sensory data entering their awareness, resulting in a state of weaponized discernment. In the early stages of their development, before experiencing the crucible of systemic betrayal or profound loss, an empath possesses no internal containment system. Their nervous system functions like an open network with no security protocols, leaving them completely vulnerable to the emotional debris, hidden hostilities, and chaotic psychological noise of anyone within their immediate proximity. They routinely mistake the anxiety, anger, or toxic shame of others for their own internal states, living in a perpetual condition of emotional exhaustion and fragmented identity. This lack of structural boundaries is precisely what makes them highly exploitable targets for predatory or cluster B personalities who view the empath's boundless emotional openness as a resource to be systematically harvested. Deep suffering completely destroys this passive open-source vulnerability by forcing the brain to engineer an unshakable psychological boundary system. When the emotional core of the empath is pushed past its absolute breaking point, the mind realizes that its current lack of defense is an existential threat to its survival. In response, it constructs an ironclad firewall. The post-suffering empath does not stop receiving the high-frequency emotional data from their environment. Their neurological radar actually becomes sharper, but the processing of that information is violently relocated. The data stream is instantly redirected away from the emotional centers of the brain, such as the amygdala, and routed directly into the cold, analytical framework of the prefrontal cortex. The incoming emotional signals are no longer allowed to penetrate the empath's core or dictate their internal chemistry. Instead, they are held at the perimeter, converted entirely into objective, actionable intelligence. This conversion process is the essence of weaponized discernment. When a transformed empath enters a room or engages with an individual, they no longer absorb the underlying tension or hidden malicious intent. They analyze it with the cold detachment of a behavioral profiler. If an individual attempts to project false guilt, hidden hostility, or manipulative charm, the empath system registers the behavioral indicators instantly, without absorbing any of the associated stress. The emotional noise that used to cause them to freeze or people please is now stripped of its power and broken down into its mechanical components. A micro-expression of contempt, a subtle shift in vocal resonance, or a calculated use of proximity. This profound level of discernment acts as a lethal defensive weapon. The empath can sit across from a highly manipulative individual, completely read the hidden architecture of their strategy, and remain entirely untouched, watching the manipulation attempt fail in real time. The suffering has essentially transformed their empathy from an agonizing vulnerability into a precise tool of absolute self-preservation, giving them the ability to surgically cut through deception and maintain total psychological insulation in any environment. The final stage of the empath's transformation through deep suffering is the attainment of absolute psychological sovereignty, a structural shift from a passive receptor to a commanding force within any social matrix. Before experiencing the crucible of profound emotional devastation, an empath is essentially a victim of the environment, constantly adapting their internal state to match the chaotic energy of the people around them. They operate as a human sponge, absorbing the ambient tension, hidden agendas, and unexpressed conflicts of whatever space they occupy, which leaves them constantly depleted and structurally off balance. This lack of internal authority makes them inherently reactive, forced to play a perpetual game of defense against the psychological currents of their world. They are highly susceptible to being managed, redirected, or silenced by dominant and manipulative personalities who take advantage of the empath's instinctive drive to yield and harmonize. Deep suffering completely incinerates this submissive, reactive posture, forcing a permanent transition into the role of the sovereign profiler. When an empath has survived the absolute worst that human betrayal and psychological manipulation can inflict, they lose the capacity for fear within interpersonal dynamics. The worst has already happened, the old self has already died, and what remains is an unshakable, hardened core of absolute autonomy. The post-suffering empath no longer walks into a room hoping to be accepted, nor do they look around to see how they need to adapt to make others comfortable. Instead, they enter a room as an invisible authority figure, an analytical operator who quietly and systematically deconstructs the hidden power dynamics, alliances, and behavioral baseline metrics of every individual present within 90 seconds. They cease to be a passive participant in the room's energy and instead become the silent axis around which the room's psychological dynamic revolves. This state of sovereignty completely alters the physics of human influence. Because the transformed empath has mapped out the exact mechanics of manipulation, gaslighting, and emotional leverage through their own agonized survival, they become entirely immune to external control. When a dominant or predatory personality attempts to project power or exert influence, the sovereign empath does not flinch or experience a surge of defensive anxiety. Instead, they meet the attempt with a cold, unblinking clarity that signals absolute transparency. They see the underlying insecurity driving the behavior, and by refusing to participate in the expected emotional script, they completely neutralize the manipulator's leverage. This effortless resistance creates a massive psychological imbalance, shifting the discomfort back onto the instigator. The empath's silence and calm, clinical observation become a mirror that forces the manipulator to see their own transparent maneuvers, causing them to stutter, overcompensate, or retreat entirely. The suffering has stripped away the empath's need for external validation, replacing it with an internal, self-sustaining authority that cannot be shaken, bought, or broken. They have mastered the art of being entirely present in the room while remaining completely untouchable by it, wielding their hyperacute intuition not as a vulnerability, but as a silent, commanding weapon of absolute psychological dominance.